Hi everyone, welcome to Penn Hillel. My name is Jacob Cohen and I'm a junior from Cleveland, Ohio and the co-president of Pi Patch. We're here for a riveting debate, but before the debate we want to take a moment to pause for a more somber tribute. 2 times in the last 6 months, our community and our country has been sent into a collective state of shock when an anti-Semitic gunman opened fire during Shabbat services. First at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Squirrel Hill, Pennsylvania, and again, just last weekend, at Chabad in Poway, California. In Pittsburgh, 11 lives were lost, including one of our own, Dr. Jerry Rabinowitz, Penn class of 1973. This evening's event is sponsored in his memory, and we are gathered here to pay tribute to his memory and remember all who were murdered simply because they were Jewish. It might feel a bit difficult to transition back and forth between the excitement of a debate and the somberness of a tribute, but we hope it will amplify and make the evening more significant and meaningful. Now I would like to introduce Noah Jett, a Penn junior from Squirrel Hill, who will share a tribute to Dr. Rabinowitz.
I don't think the microphone is working, but I hope you can hear me in the back. Yeah? Great, okay. Good evening, my name is Noah. I'm a junior in the college, and this year I'm co-chair for J Street U. I have been honored with the daunting task of beginning this event with a short tribute to Penn alumnus, Dr. Jerry Rabinowitz, in whose memory this event is dedicated. Thank you to the Woldenberg-Askowitz family for helping make tonight possible. Jerry was one of 11 victims killed last October in the Tree of Life shooting in my home of Pittsburgh. As by now we are all aware, on the 6-month anniversary of the shooting and the last day of Passover, another white supremacist opened fire at a synagogue outside of San Diego, killing 1 person and injuring several others. Anti-Semitic violence has become all too common in our society today, and it is natural to feel hurt, heartbroken, outraged, afraid. The worst thing that we can do, however, is allow our fear to paralyze us from continuing to gather in Jewish spaces and as Jewish communities. Tonight, we come together in honor of Jerry to further our understanding of issues affecting the Jewish people today and to enhance our knowledge as a community. This in itself is an act of defiance and resistance. Although his life was tragically cut short, Jerry managed to achieve a remarkable amount. His accolades and successes tell a story of themselves. Jerry was a family doctor, a loving husband, and an enthusiastic member of Dor Chadash, one of the 3 congregations housed in the Tree of Life building. He became president of the medical staff of Shadyside Hospital in 1993 and cared for AIDS patients when few others would. An active member of the Jewish community, he served as president of his synagogue. He approached every relationship in his life, whether with his wife, a patient, or a congregant, with compassion and vitality. As his longtime rabbi, Rabbi Sherrill, wrote, Jerry was the guy in the room with the biggest smile and the best belly laugh, the one that everyone wanted to sit next to, and the one who would sit next to the stranger in the room who knew no one. I never had the privilege of knowing Jerry. It is a strange experience to write a tribute to a man that you've never met. However, the stories I have heard from people in Pittsburgh and on the news bring him to life. Several weeks ago, I returned home for Passover and went to first night Seder at our close family friend's house. The family belonged to Dor Chadash and knew Jerry well. After we had completed Seder, I asked one of them if she could share a little about Jerry. Her eyes lit up as she remembered his smile and his energy for life. Despite years of friendship, she told me that she had never known about half of his accomplishments being reported on the news because he never talked about them. It was only in his death that she learned about his work with AIDS patients. She thought he was just a family doctor. He was, as she said, someone who did the right thing every day. As she spoke, she became overwhelmed with emotion at his memory. It was clear the impact that he had on her and on every person with whom he interacted. Jerry offers us an example of a life lived to the fullest, personally, professionally, religiously. I think we can all learn from Jerry. His unmatched humility and an inexhaustible desire to help others can guide us in our own lives. We can honor him by living deliberately, engaging in our communities, and committing ourselves to those in need. May his memory be a blessing. And now the Shabbatones Penned Jewish a cappella group will be singing Arim Roshi, a modern Israeli song that includes lines from Psalm 121, a psalm that Jerry loved.
אני כעת במשעול העובד, כי ילד ההולך לו לאיבוד, כפות ידיים גושתות מבקשות את העזרה, להמשיך איתך את המסע. בצדדים הפרחים כאילו איבדו את זהותם, מחפשים עוד קרן אור שתעזור, עוד לגימה קטנה של מים ממעיוני החוכמה, תביא להם את התקווה. ארים ראשי, אשא עיניי אל ההרים במרחקים, וקולי יישמע כזעקה, כתפילת האדם, וליבי יקרא. מאין יבוא עזרי, בנופים חדשים, הצעדים הם נעשים כה איטיים. מה יש שם שאין פה? שאל אותי עובר. מה בלב אתה שומר? קשיש העיר שעל גבו מונח כל עברו, מביט סביב ומחפש את עולמו, שההווה כל כך קשה, לא אומר דבר, ארים ראשי אל המחר, ארים ראשי אשא עיניי אל ההרים במרחקים, וקולי יישמע כזעקה, כתפילת האדם, וליבי יקרא. מאין יבוא עזרי,
Thank you to Jacob, Noah, the Shabbatones, and everyone who worked to put this event together. Thank you as well to the Penn Israel Alliance, without whom this event simply would not have happened. My name is Alison Garhofsky. I'm the president of Penn Israel Alliance and a sophomore in the college in Wharton. On behalf of the whole Pelton Hill community, we would like to thank the Woldenberg-Askowitz family for their generous donation and support in making this event a reality, especially in memory of Dr. Jerry Rabinowitz. It seems like every day, anti-Semitic attacks hit closer and closer to home, whether it be here in Philly or in Southern California, where I'm personally from. And yet every day, I'm reminded of the strength and resilience of this community, a group of people who are dedicated, passionate, and most importantly, not afraid to stand up for what they believe in. Now make no mistake, you may disagree with the person sitting next to you on issues of policy and even religion, and that's okay. Believe me, our guests here today will disagree plenty as well. But at the end of the day, you share a common interest that brought you here today, a foundation that unites this community here at Penn with like-minded individuals around the world. Now, given the events of this past weekend, between the Poway shooting and the controversial New York Times cartoon, this debate seems particularly relevant, and it's a rare opportunity to hear from two individuals right there on the front lines. Bret Stephens has been an op-ed columnist and associate director for the New York Times since 2017. Previously, he served as the deputy editor of the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal and editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post. He is the recipient of numerous awards and distinctions, including the 2019 Ellis Island Medal of Honor, the 2013 Pulitzer Prize for Commentary, and 3 honorary doctorates. His 2014 book, American Retreat, The New Isolationism and the Coming Global Disorder, was hailed by former Secretary of State George Shultz as wise counsel for constructive, tough-minded, and sensible foreign policy. Mr. Stephens was raised in Mexico City and educated at the University of Chicago and the London School of Economics. In addition to his work at the Times, he is a senior political analyst for MSNBC and a co-founder of the Renewed Democracy Initiative. Peter Beinart is a professor of journalism and political science at the City University of New York. He's also a contributor to The Atlantic, a senior columnist at The Forward, a CNN political commentator, and a non-resident fellow at the Foundation for Middle East Peace. His books, The Good Fight, The Icarus Syndrome, and The Crisis of Zionism have received critical acclaim around the world. Mr. Beinart has written for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, and among many other publications. He was named Columnist of the Year by The Week magazine in 2004, and in 2005 he gave the Theodore H. White Lecture at the Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Mr. Beinart graduated from Yale University, after which he attended Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship. So 2 pretty impressive people to look up to. Now, quick note on the structure of today's event. Our program will be a debate on American Judaism, anti-Semitism, and Israel, moderated by Rabbi Mike Uram, Executive Director of Penn Hillel. When you walked in, you may have found an index card on your seat. If during the debate you have a question for either of the panelists, please write your question on the index cards and pass it towards the individuals sitting in the aisles. Penn Israel Alliance members will be walking down the aisles every 10 to 15 minutes or so, collecting those index cards and bringing them up to Rabbi Mike. Now, the questions that Rabbi Mike asks will be a combination of audience questions and pre-written questions as well. We hope that this format will be engaging for everyone, and we ask that no other interruptions are had during the event. We encourage you to sit back, relax, and enjoy the discussion. Most importantly, thank you all for joining us this evening, and a big thank you to Bret Stephens and Peter Beinart for engaging with all in this setting. Please join me in welcoming Bret and Peter to the stage, and with that, I will turn it over to Rabbi Mike.
Welcome, everyone. Give me one sec. Welcome, everyone. It's great to have you here. To our guests, to Bret and to Peter, thank you so much for joining us. It's an honor to have you. It's also, I just want you to know, it's very close to the end of the year. In a normal campus, students would be studying. With Penn students, they're able to both plan amazing events, attend amazing events, and study for finals and finish up the last assignments for the semester. So thank you guys for coming. We're going to deal with some heady stuff tonight, and I'm going to try to ask questions that give the panelists a chance to really to articulate insights, to debate each other. If you haven't read the writings of either of the panelists, you're missing out. They're both incredibly brilliant, incisive, and eloquent writers. And we're hopefully just going to set the stage for them to really go at each other, to rival the kind of uncivil discourse that we know in America today. Starting on a light topic, let's begin with anti-Semitism. So Jews have a little bit of trauma in their past, and it's not uncommon for Jews to kind of wave the flag of anti-Semitism and call foul when they perceive anti-Semitism. And sometimes maybe we've overstepped that in different generations, and I also think we're living in a time where many other minority groups are waving their flags of marginalization and persecution. And so one of the questions that students generated was like, do you think that this perceived rise in anti-Semitism is really as intense as it is, or is this just the Jewish habit of calling anti-Semitism, in every direction?
Who starts? I mean, I guess I would say, but is this on? I think until recently, I might have been inclined to think that that the threat of anti-Semitism was being exaggerated, but two synagogue shootings in 6 months are pretty powerful evidence that there's something worrying going on. And when I was in the day of the California shooting, I was actually in Amsterdam, and I found online a shul in Amsterdam, and I went there, and I got to the address, and there was no marking, and I went to open the door was locked, and then all of a sudden this guy comes from out of nowhere, like with a walkie-talkie. I mean, I've had a little bit of this experience, but he says to me, what are you doing? And I said, well, I'm here to go to shul. And he said, what? He started quizzing me in a way I've never experienced before. So she said, what is the Shabbat service like? I was like, well, I don't know, you start with Sukkah de Zimra, Shachri, I don't know. He's like, what do Jews do on Passover? I'm like, I mean, they eat matzah, they eat maror, like, I don't know, Rabbi Gamliel said, I didn't know what he wanted me to exactly. Finally, literally, even, I don't know, that wasn't good enough for him. I can't quite exactly figure out, what I got wrong. But finally, he literally said to me, and it was just like, it was very struck me, because then I came back, and after Shabbat, I heard about California. He said, he asked me to recite Shema. And only when I had recited Shema did he let me in shul. And I was actually the 10th guy for a minyan, so they needed me. But I delayed things a lot because of that. And and thinking about that as a kind of dystopic vision of it just made me feel profoundly sad and disturbed to imagine that we might move even half or quarter of the way in that direction, and that would what be like going to shul in the United States would be like. So there is something real, and anti-Semitism is always a complicated phenomenon. I guess I would say I think that in the United States, I think that anti-Semitism is deeply bound up with the other forms of bigotry that have been revived in this era, and I think it's very significant that both the Pittsburgh shooter and the California shooter, both in their writings, reference the idea that Jews were some way responsible for the fact that all these immigrants were coming in from Latin America. And I think that part of what's happening is that there is this tremendous kind of fear and terror that Trump and others have stoked about the changing demography of the United States, about growing Muslim population, a growing Latino population. But the stereotypes of Latinos, the racist stereotypes, suggest on the one hand that they're this grave threat, on the other hand that they're inferior. So if they're inferior, how are they managing to organize these massive caravans that are invading the United States? And that's where I think Jews come in, because the stereotype of Jews is different. It's more like Jews are the evil geniuses. right? It's a different stereotype than you have of people of color. And so I think we have this now. One of the things that I would really plead with my kind of conservative or kind of anti-immigrant Jewish friends is to realize the degree to which Trump's version of nativism, I think, is fueling anti-Semitism, because the whole nativist story is basically that you need Jews in order to facilitate this invasion. We saw this before. If you look at the civil rights movement, there were people who were always saying the Jewish communists are organizing the civil rights movement. Why? Because the black people obviously couldn't do it themselves. Remember, in South Africa, it was the same thing. They thought Joe Slovo, this Jewish guy, was behind everything the ANC was doing. And so I think it's important to see these things as intertwined and to recognize that the struggle against anti-Semitism has to also be a struggle against xenophobia and a struggle against Islamophobia, because I think they're very tightly linked.
So, is this on? Can you hear me?
Just a little switch.
Yes.
Little switch.
How's this? Okay. So I happen, I guess by chance, to have experiences of two significant anti-Semitic incidents, almost back to back in the last few days. In some ways, the one you're obviously familiar with involves the cartoon that appeared in the print edition of the International New York Times. And I'd like to say a word about that in a moment, but to me the much more frightening incident took place the next day. My wife and I were visiting a friend of ours who had just given birth at NYU Hospital, which is on 31st and 1st Avenue in Manhattan. And we're getting out of the cab, and a man is walking out of the hospital who's an Orthodox Jew wearing a wide-brimmed hat, white beard, coming towards us, clearly wants the cab, so I hold the door for the guy. As the man is getting in the cab, another man is walking up the street and says, "Hey, Jew, Jew, Jew." And my wife says, "What did you say?" And as he's walking by, you have to know this incident all takes place in about 7 seconds. He says, "You heard me." And I turn to him and I say, "Hey, asshole." And he walks off. Now, I don't want to characterize this individual in any other way other than to say he was not wearing a MAGA hat and was probably not a MAGA person, okay? But the reason I find this so significant is this isn't some white nationalist unhinged guy who's walking in, with body armor and a gun and shooting someone. This is an everyday incident in the most Jewish city, not only in the United States, but perhaps outside of Tel Aviv, the most Jewish city in the world. And it happened just like that. And you talk to, especially in Brooklyn, you talk to people who are quote, visibly Jewish, wearing headgear of one description or another, and they report this all the time. Now, it's happening, I think, there's a confluence of factors here. I think Peter laid out eloquently and correctly one of those streams, which is that you have an administration that is using language, knowingly or not, that replicates classic tropes that have been deployed by anti-Semites for generations. When the president attacks the globalists, when he attacks international bankers, when he goes on about the threat posed by immigrants, Trump himself may not recognize this as anti-Semitism, but a guy like David Duke certainly recognizes it as anti-Semitism. And in particular, when Trump employs conspiracy theories at the center of his worldview, let's not forget that anti-Semitism is not simply a bigotry, it's also a conspiracy theory. It's the belief that some malign group of people are conspiring to screw the little guy. And who are those maligners? Well, they're the Jews. But there's another side to this which worries me a great deal and has been sort of part and parcel of my career for now almost 18 years. I was a young writer for the Wall Street Journal based in Brussels in 2001. And then the second intifada erupted, and all of a sudden there was imagery in the European press that made the cartoon that appeared in the New York Times seem relatively tame by comparison. Hook-nosed Ariel Sharon eating babies in the manner of a famous, or a famous Goya painting. The Israeli soldiers depicted as Roman centurions killing a Palestinian Christ on a cross. All of this became ubiquitous. And then after 9/11, it became that much more powerful. A French ambassador to Great Britain said that it's because of Israel that the world is being brought to the brink of World War III. This was a statement from the ambassador of France. Now, I saw all of this through the lens of my position then as the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post and then as foreign affairs columnist at the Wall Street Journal, where, and here I suspect Peter and I may have some differences, where the constant demonization of Israel as a uniquely destructive force in international affairs that was responsible not only, in this view, for the dehumanization of Palestinians, but for literally bringing us to the brink of World War III, struck me as replicating increasingly in form and sometimes in substance the very tropes that had been used in slightly, mutatis mutandis, as they say, against Jews in previous generations. So Jews, if it wasn't Jews who were destroying the world, it was the Jewish state. If it wasn't Jews who were committing genocide against some innocent people, it was the Jewish state. And all of that, in a sense, I thought was, in a way, perfectly captured by the cartoon that appeared in the Times, because that, to me, struck me as the perfect representation of how 21st century anti-Zionism, what is supposed to be, on the surface, a cartoon that's simply about the Prime Minister of Israel and his ostensible control of the foreign policy of the United States and the President of the United States, ended up duplicating in so many significant factors imagery that in a past generation you could have seen in the pages of Der Stürmer or other anti-Semitic publications. So you have these two things coming at the Jewish people, both from the right and from the left. A demagogic nationalism that we have a long history with, and a kind of a postmodern, or whatever you want to call it, anti-Zionism, which is less distinct from anti-Semitism than I think some progressives would care to acknowledge.
So how do each of you formulate that line? Where does anti-Zionism or criticism of Israel or anti-Israel activity on campus, sometimes these terms are used interchangeably, even though they may not be really interchangeable, but what's the line where it becomes anti-Semitic? And I think what I'd love to hear as part of that answer is things like the BDS movement, the international BDS movement. Is it inherently anti-Semitic to be part of the BDS movement? Are the strings of that movement being pulled by anti-Semites? How do those things intersect?
Look, I mean, I think in significant respects, anti-Zionism is the anti-Semitism of our day. I know because I read Peter as often as I can, and I admire him as a writer. Whatever our disagreements, I underscore that point. I admire him as a writer, and he doesn't agree with that. But let's not forget that anti-Semitism is a coinage that appears for the first time in the 1870s. And why do we have this term anti-Semitism? Because Wilhelm Marr, a German pamphleteer, decided that old-fashioned Jewish hatred on the basis of religion had to be replaced with a new version of the hatred of Jews on the basis of race, which was the kind of specious scientism of its day. So the fortunate repudiation of anti-Semitism as a, quote, reputable version of hatred of Jews obviously ended pretty much in 1945, but the will to hate Jews didn't end with that. I mean, one of the things about anti-Semitism, I'm using this term sort of as the common term, that's so dangerous and so difficult, is that it's a shape-shifting phenomenon. So Jews are hated for their cosmopolitanism. Okay, they're no longer cosmopolitan, then Jews are hated for their nationalism. They're not hated for, or they're hated for their religion and their adherence to the old religion. Well, they're not hated for that, they're hated for their lack of religion, right? Jews as the godless atheists, the Bolsheviks. They're hated for their control of money. They're hated for their hatred of money. It's one thing or another. And in any of these iterations, or most of these iterations, exceptions can be found for good Jews, right? Who don't fall under the rubric. The Nazis were in a sense exceptional, and their anti-Semitism made no room for, some of my best friends, so to speak. But in so many respects, anti-Zionism not only replicates the tropes of anti-Semitism, right? But it's a hatred in its own form that should be disreputable. I don't know of anyone who says, let's get rid of Bangladesh, okay? Take me through the history of Bangladesh and I will show you a great deal of misery, a great deal of oppression, a great deal of fanaticism. But no one says Bangladesh was a bad idea, right? No, just very briefly. No one says this of nearly any other state. It is unique that there is a movement that has a kind of specious form of respectability, even on academic settings, that says that one state and one state only uniquely lacks legitimacy and should not exist as it's constituted. And I don't see how you get away, unless you make a very good argument, how that isn't a form of anti-Semitism. And it doesn't matter that you can find 6 rabbis and 7 guys at Mondoweiss or whatever who are Jewish and don't feel differently. There's a Meshuggah in every community.
So, Peter, I want to give you a chance for something, but I also want to, and maybe Bret, you'll respond after Peter does, but I want to also ask you to be a little bit focused on, for students in the room, like, what's that dividing line? When there are club activities that are critical of Israel, when there are professors or textbooks that have certain perspectives, there are people in our world saying, we have to stop that because that is anti-Semitic. And there's a debate about, like, well, what's the line, right? This is critical of a policy, and I want us to tee you up, Peter, to also address, like, is Israel really the only country that people throughout history have said, like, it's an illegitimate state, or does that take in other forms?
No, I think that if you change if you think about it in terms of regime, right, which is to say that the guiding regime, by which I don't mean the government of the moment, but the constitutional system, you feel like is inherently discriminatory. And you want to replace that with a different constitutional system, right? That actually happens all over the place, right? I think almost all of us would probably agree that we would want Iran not just to have a new election, we would want it to have a fundamental change of constitutional order, right? They're trying to do that. Hopefully they'll do that in Sudan. That's what people wanted to do in South Africa. That's what people want to do. That's what people push for in kind of revolutionary situations in many, many different parts of the world. So I think this term about kind of Israel's the only country that people don't want to exist, I think actually misunderstands what's actually happening, which is to say you have a group of people, you have anti-Zionists who basically don't want the system of Jewish privilege that Zionism represents to exist. They want to replace it with something else. Now, are some of those people anti-Zionist? Absolutely, some of those people are anti-Zionist. There's a lot of are some of them anti-Semites? Of course. There's a lot of anti-Semitism in the Middle East. The Hamas has put out very, very anti-Semitic documents, and you can find polling which shows that a very disturbingly high percentage of people in the Middle East, for instance, and not just the Middle East, who are anti-Zionist, have all kinds of anti-Semitic notions. They think to read the Protocols of Elders of Zion and these kind of things. But I start from a basic understanding of the fact that for most Palestinians, the vast majority of Palestinians, anti-Zionism is a fairly understandable and natural political perspective, right? Zionism for the Jewish people has been an enormous blessing, right? For the Palestinians, it has been a disaster, right? This is a movement that emerged in the 19th century when the vast, vast majority of people in this territory were people who were beginning to who were Arabs who were beginning to develop a Palestinian political consciousness, right? There was a small Jewish population, but it was not a Zionist population, right? The Zionist movement, for very understandable reasons from a Jewish perspective, wanted to have a nationalist movement. It could only have a nationalist movement given Jewish history and Jewish theology in the land of Israel. And then you had a series of clashes in which Palestinians lost and lost and lost again. If you know Palestinians, you know that virtually every single Palestinian has in their family tremendous trauma as a result of this, as a result of the, of the fact that 750,000 or so people had to leave their homes during Israel's War of Independence, the fact that you have people now dispersed across the world in refugee camps, living in the West Bank and Gaza without basic rights. And so, to me, the acid test is, do you believe that both Jews and Palestinians have the right to live in safety and dignity between the Mediterranean and the Jordan? Right? That's the key question. That's, I think, the test that Hamas fails. But it's the test that a lot of BDS supporters that I know quite well, Palestinian activists, I think they pass. That doesn't mean my view is the same as you. Mine not. I believe in a two-state solution. I support a kind of a democratic Jewish state. But I just want to read you something very briefly, right? Because you've probably heard of the nation-state law, right? The nation-state law was passed in Israel. At the time of the nation-state law, 3 Palestinian Arab members of the Knesset proposed their own basic law. Israel doesn't have a constitution, but it has these basic laws which have kind of quasi-constitutional authority, right? And this is the basic law that these 3 Palestinian MKs proposed, right? It says, the purpose of this basic law is to enshrine the principle of equal citizenship for every citizen while recognizing the existence and rights of the 2 national groups, the Jewish one and the Arab one, living within the borders of the state as recognized by international law. The government of the state is based on the values of human dignity, liberty, and equality between all humans. The government of the state is based on the separation of religion and state while guaranteeing freedom of worship to all religions. Now, their view is not my view. I do not support the idea of a binational state. I think it would probably not work very well in practice, and I think binationalism in general is very, very hard to work, and I'm still a believer in the idea of a two-state solution. But I don't think this is an anti-Semitic document. And if you believe that anti-Zionism is inherently anti-Semitism, you have to believe this is an anti-Semitic document. And I know enough people who held this view, who want one equal state, not a Jewish state, in large measure because they believe, understandably, that Zionism privileges Jews, and the flip side of Zionism privileging Jews, even inside the Green Line, is that Zionism means that Palestinians are not treated as well as Jews, right? Think of Israel. Israel is creating a government now, right? Bibi is trying to, get his coalition together, right? By tradition in Israel, to have a legitimate government, you have to get 61 Jewish seats in the Knesset. You cannot bring Palestinian Arab parties in. They never have been included formally in a government coalition. So that means that Arab Israeli citizens always lose out in the distribution of resources because in a Jewish state, it's considered only legitimate if your government is constituted with Jewish seats. That has all kinds of negative effects for Palestinian citizens. So this is why, there are other reasons too. We could talk about the Satmar, we could talk about other things. The last point I would make is that while I totally concede that there is a significant Venn diagram of anti-Zionists who are also anti-Semites, it's also important to remember that there is a Venn diagram of Zionists who are anti-Semites, right? Because after all, if you don't want Jews in your country, the idea of them having their own country to go to is actually a fairly attractive idea. Arthur Balfour, right? I know people literally name Balfour, right? He was a big anti-Semite, right? One of the reasons he actually wanted a national home for the Jews is he had supported the Aliens Act in 1905 in Britain, which shut down Eastern European Jewish immigration. He didn't want more Jews coming to Britain. The Polish government in the 1930s was extremely Zionist because they wanted their Jewish population in Poland to go somewhere other than Poland. They actually trained Beitar militia. So anyway, I think it's a more complicated story, and I think this is some of the terrain on which Bret and I disagree.
Good. So I hope that's a good setup for you, Bret, to want to respond. Take some of these things apart.
There were just 1 or 2 points. just a very brief point. Okay, we all want, well, I guess Peter and I and many other people would like regime change in Iran. Okay? After regime change in Iran, Iran will still be Iran. Okay, so the comment that you made at the beginning is just a terrible analogy. Okay?
South Africa was still South Africa.
No, hang on a second. allow me after your
Please,
7 minutes
please.
soliloquy to just make one or two brief points.
If you check YouTube, you can see that Bret has actually accused Peter several times of going on long soliloquies this partnership.
So, if you had regime change in Israel, the state would not be called Israel. Okay, this is the essential point. Okay, a binational state in which whatever it is, 40, 50, 60% of the population were Palestinian or non-Jewish would cease to be Israel, characterologically, in every respect. So the analogy is simply an extremely bad analogy. South Africa, by the way, beforehand was not really South Africa, okay? It was a white Africa or whatever it was. So this is a first point that needs a distinction that needs to be made. Secondly, the nation-state law was ill-conceived, it was foolish, it shouldn't have passed, and I posted publicly in the pages of the New York Times so that anyone who then says Bret Stephens goes along with everything that Bibi says does, I actually supported Benny Gantz in the election as well. But most of what the nation-state law did is proclaim things like Hebrew shall be the official language of Israel. Who knew Hebrew wasn't the official language of Israel? A few people did, right? Or this flag of the state of Israel should be a white, with two blue stripes and a blue Star of David in between. So the nation-state law, although it was gratuitous, unnecessary, and extraordinarily obnoxious to Israel's minorities, did not actually constitute this kind of eradication of Israel's democratic or even its fundamentally liberal character. And that point, I think, is needs to be made too. There's one larger point here that I feel that needs to be stressed, and this is to an American audience. You might not know this, but if you're Danish, right, you have to pay a tax to the Danish Lutheran Church. Most of us think of Denmark as almost like the utopia of the liberal state. But Denmark has an established religion, and everyone in Denmark, whether they're Lutherans or not, has some obligation to the church. In Great Britain, the head of state, Queen Elizabeth, is not only the head of the state, she's also the head of the Church of England. You go around the world, and most of the world consists of states that one way or another privilege certain ethnic groups within them. Now, as Americans, this offends our idea of what a true liberal democracy ought to be. But the reality is that much of the world is constructed of nation states that provide these privileges to certain groups inside of them. And in that respect, Israel is simply following that model. Now, as an American, there are aspects of it that I don't like, but I accept it, and I also accept that Israel is doing a pretty good job within that model of being democratic and of respecting certain liberal civil rights in a way that in some ways actually shames the rest of the world in terms of how genuinely progressive they are. Just to give you an example, I know this might surprise you, but only until about 6 years ago could gay men and women, or it was only 6 years ago that gay men and women could serve openly in the United States military. This was a huge thing that happened, like when you were in high school or whatever, middle school. Right? This happened in Israel long before you were born. So to a large extent, Israel has been advancing liberal and democratic values for a long time. Now to Peter's larger point. You can absolutely find excellent examples of anti-Zionists or Zionists who are anti-Semites. I just find it fascinating that Peter has to reach back over 100 years in history. Kaiser Wilhelm was another one. I mean, there are plenty of people here who said all the Jews should go to Palestine until Hitler had a better idea and said, no, let's kill all the Jews instead. But nowadays, when we're talking about the 21st century, the Venn diagram of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism overlaps to a stunning extent. And it's an extent that progressives especially have been in denial about for a long time. You know, just as we, in Judaism, we ring fence all kinds of laws, especially, you know, in terms of like our kosher observance, for example, because we want to be cautious because we understand that certain kinds of behavior, even if they are not in themselves violations, approach the violation, and we have to take care of we have to take care of them. So for a great many years, we have erased that ring fence against the ceaseless, endless, not only criticism, but I would argue almost borderline demonization of Israel. And it's all fine because it's just strong criticism of Israel. And then it says, well, if we can criticize Israel this strongly, why don't we raise the other interesting question, which cannot, strictly speaking, be called anti-Semitic, because after all, we can think of a bunch of Jews who feel the same way too, which is, let's call the existence of the state into question. And let's remind ourselves that there is at least one group, Palestinians, who might have a legitimate claim to being, or much more of a legitimate claim to be anti-Zionist. But all of this has brought us to the point where suddenly the guardrails have all been erased, and an editor at the New York Times can no longer distinguish between what is anti-Zionism and just the usual criticism of Benjamin Netanyahu, right, and an outright anti-Semitic cartoon. Now notice the distinction, by the way, between what Jews have been doing to themselves and what, say, African Americans have been doing for their community in the past 30 years. It's something I think all of us on this stage support, which is after the end of Jim Crow, after the end of legal segregation, African Americans, to their infinite credit and with great wisdom, stood up and said, we're not going to take cultural bigotry either. So if you tell a racist joke on TV, as, who's the Kramer figure on Seinfeld? I forgot his name. Yeah. Michael Richards has been run out of town for racist on-stage routines after his Seinfeld fame. That's a good thing, because those taboos against casual racism serve the larger interest of guarding against racism in society. They ring-fence the African American community against the kind of casual racism that used to be, even when I was a kid, fairly commonplace. Now, who is ring-fencing? I'll just finish with this. Who is ring-fencing today the Jews against anti-Semitic attacks? Not so many people, because the things that now people can say about Jews or the Jewish state are shocking, and we allow it, and we argue with ourselves as to what exactly is permissible and what crosses the line. We shouldn't be talking about what the line is at its very edge. We should be expanding the border so that people, when they open their mouths, think, gee, this is a sensitive topic, and we should be thoughtful about what we're saying before we mouth off and say, well, as far as I'm concerned, Israel is the worst state in the world, and they're committing genocide in Gaza, and Benjamin Netanyahu should be sent to a war crimes tribunal. That's what we're not doing, and that's the heart of the problem the Jews face today.
So, yeah, I just want to say one of the questions that did come from the audience was about the allegations of people being self-hating Jews. People, like, essentially, that there's one camp that said, let's draw this line, let's put a fence around the Torah so that people can't even approach it. And then there's another group of Jews that is often leading the charge of criticism. And so since it's been sanctioned by a Jewish voice, now all of a sudden it's okay to say. So I'm interested to hear how you react to that.
Yeah, let me just, first of all, I don't think it's very hard, just to respond to Bret, I don't think it's very hard to think of people today who are both strongly Zionistic and at least flirt very clearly with anti-Semitism. I think one of them is the President of the United States, right? Another one is Steve Bannon, another one is Glenn Beck, another one is Jerry Falwell, another one is Pat Robertson. I mean, there are a lot of people like that. I actually don't think it's hard to find them today at all. I don't think you have to go 100 years ago. I also don't recognize a world in which the African American community has succeeded in making anti-black racism traits, but the American Jewish community is too timid to somehow make anti-Zionism or anti-Zionism traits. I mean, Donald Trump is our president, for goodness sakes. And what the organized American Jewish community is doing is trying to criminalize BDS and anti-Zionism. They came very close in the University of California system to saying that anti-Zionism was bigotry, was part of a list of groups of you have people at the Department of Education now who are basically trying to use the definition of anti-Semitism, which includes anti-Zionism, and therefore essentially, potentially, means that you can't have an anti-Zionist organization like Students for Justice in Palestine on campus. There are laws across the country being passed saying that if you support BDS, which the vast majority of Palestinians do, I don't, but the vast majority of Palestinians do, it's a non-violent movement, that you can't do any business with the state government, right? If you're a special education teacher who has your own company that does special education, you can't contract with your local school board, right? So I don't see a world in which the African American community has been so successful in ring fencing, and we haven't tried to ring fence. To the contrary, I think what's happened is that because the American Jewish community doesn't actually want, is basically trying to delegitimize Palestinian politics, doesn't want to allow Palestinians to create a conversation about Zionism, it is essentially just trying to say that Zionism, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, and therefore the conversation can't take place, or that at least that you're going to incur serious penalties for trying to do that. On the question of self-hating Jew, I mean, I guess I would just say, there's a certain view that says that Jews should not air dirty laundry in front of the Gentiles, right? And people will sometimes say this to me, like, you write these very critical things, Israel, don't you see that you're giving aid and comfort to all these people who hate Israel out there? And I guess what I think when people say that is, if I devoted every single day of the rest of my life to saying critical things about Jewish behavior, I would still not get anywhere near Tanakh, right? If you want to look at one text, which is a compendium of Jews behaving badly, right, I would suggest you look at the Hebrew Bible, right? And in fact, the Hebrew Bible was used by anti-Semites. I mean, what do we read on Yom Kippur, right? That the Roman emperor comes to the rabbis of the Roman period and basically says, no one paid for the sale of Yosef, right? So now you are going to pay for the sale of Yosef, right? There has been a history of using our recording of the criticisms, our own misdeeds against us, but I think that our tradition has said it is more important to hold us to a higher standard. And so that's the principle that I take.
So I wanted do you want to...
I would never accuse Peter of being a self-hating Jew. He's very much a self-loving Jew.
But that's the thing, isn't it? I know lots of Jews who hate other Jews. I actually still yet to meet one who hates themselves.
I'm kind of a self-hating Jew. I mean, I had some Jewish baggage. I don't know if anyone else feels conflicted, but that's another matter, especially after Passover. Okay. But so,
I just have to interject. At one point, I was talking to a group of students around a table, like 20 students, and just in jest, all Jewish students in some Jewish program, and I said, I sometimes thank God I was born Jewish because otherwise I'd be a raging anti-Semite. Everyone laughs, but this was on video and it ended up on YouTube, and then the Daily Stormer picked it up and I said, you see, when they're talking amongst themselves.
So, I want to ask two more questions somewhat related in this area, and we can try to, we're actually doing well on time, but we can try to be a little bit brief on these. One is, someone from the audience talked about feeling torn. That they, and my guess is that this is indicative of like a good number of people in the world who they don't love Trump. They don't think that he's necessarily fit to be president. They may not love some of the rhetoric he uses or some of the things he says on Twitter. And and they may even like lean towards the Democratic Party, which the majority of American Jews still do. And yet they feel torn because there are these personalities in the Democratic Party now who are getting a lot of attention, who are saying things about Israel or being accused of saying things about Jews. Right, people like Ilhan Omar, Rashid Tlaib, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And I'd be interested to hear, like, what's your advice, and how do you deconstruct the media circus that's going on around these people? Like, how do you line up what they're really saying, who they really are, and to what degree it's a real threat, and how much of this is something else that just means fun in the media?
So, I think that it's so important when you are associated with one side or the other of the political aisle, that you take extra pains to call out the the bigotry on your own side. So in 2015, when it became clear in the late summer of 2015 that the Trump candidacy wasn't just some kind of clown act and he was gaining traction, I began denouncing him. And I haven't stopped. Now, every now and then he does things I agree with, and in the interest of intellectual honesty, he is the president. I say, I agree with him. I'm glad he's taking a stand in favor of democracy in Venezuela. I liked the fact that he got out of the Iran deal. I approved of the move of the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. But Peter is absolutely right that there is an undercurrent on the right in the xenophobia, the appeals to nationalism, the rhetoric about so-called globalism and so on, that is playing, wittingly or not, on a series of stereotypes that will ultimately come to haunt us. And I feel a particular responsibility, being on the right, to call that out. I would hope that Peter or people on Peter's side, traditionally on the Democratic side, would be as outspoken and willing to take as much shit, excuse my language, in calling out the bigotry that's coming out of the left. Because it was very disheartening to see so many Democrats circle the wagons around Ilhan Omar. I'm not for 1 second excusing the fact that she is the victim of Islamophobia, but I'm sorry, there was a 3 strikes and you're out quality to the All About the Benjamins comments, and saying, oh well, she's just a refugee from Somalia is a form of paternalism and condescension which she doesn't deserve. She's a congresswoman from Minnesota. She knows what she's doing, and it was disheartening to see how Nancy Pelosi and Steny Hoyer and the grown-ups in the Democratic Party were shut down by the progressives, who basically argued, we will not brook any criticism of someone on our side, because at the end of the day, that just helps Donald Trump, that just helps the bad guys on the other side. The sad fact about Jewish life is that we can't afford to close our eyes to the enemies on both sides of us. They have always been there. There has always been a bigotry of the right that has been weaponized to murderous effect. But anyone who knows anything about the history of the Soviet Union and the Soviet support for anti-Israel groups and anti-Semitic groups, Baader-Meinhof times, know that that history exists on the left. And all I would say to you is it's incumbent to exert a sense of intellectual independence, not to be blindly partisan, not to simply say, okay, I'm going to choose a side, and this side is modestly better, and so I'm sticking to it. Call them out call it as you see it. There's an old saying that Jews have only survived because they've cultivated an instinct for danger. And what I'm experiencing now, 21st century America, is my whatever ancestral instinct I have for danger is I'm getting signals on both ends. And I can't stand when people say, yes, there's a little bit of anti-Semitism on one side, but it's much worse with the other guys. That's just not true. It behooves us to police our own as instead of simply pointing fingers at the other at partisans on the other side.
So I think Bret's point about the importance of holding your own side to account is very important. And I wrote, on questions of free speech, for instance, on what happened to Charles Murray at Middlebury on the protests in front of Tucker Carlson's home. I wrote a piece for the Atlantic magazine about Antifa. I've tried to be very aware and vocal when I see a kind of illiberal culture emerging on the left that threatens free speech and threatens people's dignity. But I don't buy the idea, and it is absolutely true that there is anti-Semitism on the left. Of course there is anti-Semitism on the left. But where we disagree is I don't buy the equivalence that Bret is suggesting. The equivalence between the anti-Semitism of the white nationalist right and the anti-Semitism in the United States, at least, of what you could call the Israel criticizing left. I don't see that they are of the same quality. The two people who now kill Jews in synagogues both came from the white nationalist right. the level of bigotry, the level of anti-Semitism that Donald Trump has expressed is far more unambiguous. Seems to me far clearer than Ilhan Omar. Ilhan Omar in 2012, she used the term hypnotized in the terms of something, saying that in terms of the Israel-Gaza war. Israel hypnotized the war. Very bad word to use. She apologized for it. Then she said that Israeli support, that people support Israel or support AIPAC. The AIPAC's influence comes from being about the Benjamins. What I wrote at the time was
All
that.
about the Benjamins.
Okay, all about the Benjamins. Okay, I think that's the phrase, right? What I wrote at the time was that this is way too flip a way of talking about AIPAC's influence because there is a long history of the association of Jews controlling things with money. It is also true that a large part of AIPAC's influence is about their ability to raise money, right? We cannot put ourselves in a situation where we are calling people anti-Semitic for saying things that all of us know are true.
But they're not.
They actually, AIPAC's influence, okay, we can have an argument about this. AIPAC's influence is partly the result of the fact that there are large wellsprings of pro-Israel sentiment that exist in certain pockets of the United States, and that does play a large role, particularly in AIPAC's influence in the Republican Party. But it is simply not credible to suggest AIPAC would not spend as much time as it does making all of its board members and activists hold fundraiser after fundraiser after fundraiser for politicians if they did not believe that those fundraisers were influencing what those politicians do. That's the way American politics works. We have a corrupt political system. And to Ilhan Omar, in Ilhan Omar's defense, she does not only talk about AIPAC, she also repeatedly talks about the NRA, and about big pharma, and about big oil. She talks about the corruption of the political system. And so I think that the third comment was also directed at AIPAC, and it was directed at the claim that it was not directed at the idea that Jews are loyal to a foreign country. This is the quote. It says, so for me, I want to talk about the political influence in this country that says it is okay for people to push for allegiance to a foreign country, and I want to ask why it is okay for me to talk about the influence of the NRA, of fossil fuel industries, or big pharma, and not to talk about a powerful lobbying group that is influencing policy. Look, it's true. One has to be careful when one talks about AIPAC because of the history of the idea of Jewish dual loyalty. It is also true that AIPAC is not entirely independent of the Israeli government. Do we really believe that when Benjamin Netanyahu came out against the Iran deal, that AIPAC had its own choice about whether it was going to support the Iran deal? Of course not. AIPAC, to a very, very large degree, is, in fact, doing the work of the Israeli government. That's true. And what worries me is that while I agree that one has to be sensitive to anti-Semitism on the left, what I believe a lot is going on here is that there is an effort that the fear is that people like Ilhan Omar are going to change the debate about Israel policy, and there is an effort to delegitimize and destroy people who are going to widen the possibilities of criticism of Israel. And I think there's a lot of bad faith that I see in the criticism of her, particularly because by any reasonable metric, I think that Donald Trump's anti-Semitism is far. He just referred to Benjamin Netanyahu as your prime minister just a couple of weeks ago. And Ilhan Omar, by the way, is not only a critic of Israel. She's a very fierce critic of Saudi Arabia. She's a fierce critic of the government of Egypt. She does not single out Israel. She's a supporter of human rights and a fierce critic of governments that she believes deny human rights. And Israel does deny human rights, especially to Palestinians in the West Bank.
So, Bret, do you want to respond to a piece of that?
So what you just heard is Peter kind of clearing his throat and saying, well, you know, I have criticized my own side, but let me tell you, it's so much worse on the other side. And then, so illustrating the very point that I was making, which is that when it comes to policing your own side, I think there are deficiencies, as I see it, among too many liberal intellectuals in calling out the blatant, unequivocal anti-Semitism of Ilhan Omar. And what you just heard was a long sort of exculpation. Well, she said it a few years ago. It was in the context of a war. Then she talked about the Benjamins, but she has a legitimate point. When she's talking about foreign countries, it was unclear whether it was about Israel or not. And you feel like saying, for real? I mean, really, you don't think that the influence of a foreign country, hint, hint, whisper, whisper, I mean, we're always picking up dog whistles when it comes to Steve Bannon and Donald Trump, and often rightly so. But somehow the dog whistles are completely unheard when it comes to Ilhan Omar saying something which all of you in this room know was about Israel, was about the influence of Jewish money. I'm sorry, you spoke for a long time. There is a First Amendment. There's a First Amendment in this country. You have a constitutional right to petition your government. This corrupt system of lobbies emerges from the First Amendment right to petition your government for causes that are important to you. You do it when it comes to the Sierra Club or abortion rights, Planned Parenthood. All of that is covered by the First Amendment. Guess what? Jews also have a right to petition their government on behalf of something that is important to them, emotionally, spiritually, politically, whatever, which is the U.S.-Israel relationship. How do you think AIPAC ranks in terms of the actual money it raises compared to other lobbies? And I'm not just talking about AIPAC, I'm talking about the affiliates of AIPAC, because AIPAC is not in fact a PAC, okay? But it has affiliates that do raise money. How do you think it compares to the AARP, to the NRA, to the American Manufacturers Association, to the farm lobby? And yet you would imagine, listening to this kind of rhetoric, that AIPAC is like, you know, the Harvard compared to the, I don't know, Bryn Mawr in terms of its endowment and its ability to influence politics. And that's, by the way, feeding a kind of anti-Semitic stereotype that pro-Israel Jews have a uniquely powerful influence on the Congress. One of the things you'll hear is, well, Israel gets huge amounts of foreign aid in terms of our military. No one else gets this. How much do you think it costs the United States to station 49,000 troops in Japan? Or 28,000 troops, or whatever it is in South Korea, or the tens of thousands of troops in Germany? We're also subsidizing these countries' securities, but what you will hear constantly from liberal commentators who ought to know better is that somehow we uniquely give all this money to Israel and it's the #1 beneficiary of foreign largesse. Finally, how do you think guys with no Jewish constituents back in Nebraska or whatever, who have never had to fear the influence of the Jewish vote, you know, the Ben Sasses of the world, okay? Why do you think they're pro-Israel? Because they've been manipulated by AIPAC? No, because most of them are evangelical Christians who believe this in their bones. You can like it, you can dislike it, feel however you want about it, but when you start to accuse, as Ilhan Omar did, or suggest that the reason why the Congress is pro-Israel has to do with the Benjamins, all about the Benjamins, that AIPAC is supposedly raising, then you're engaging in classic anti-Semitism. And I'm sorry, one thing that I know about all of you in this room is you're not dumb, right? You can see through this. And we shouldn't play dumb when it comes to this, because if we can hear microaggressions, if we can be annoyed by mansplaining, right, and other subtle forms of bigotry, we should be hearing the loud sonic booms of Ilhan Omar's anti-Semitism and calling it out forthrightly. And still be able to say, and by the way, the Islamophobia against her is also unacceptable. But just because you are the victim of one form of bigotry doesn't mean you can't be the purveyor of another.
I wanted to say one thing. If we're going to be ultra sensitive on the question of bigotry, and we're going to look at members of Congress, and we're going to define Ilhan Omar as a bigot because of the statements that she made. Bret and I have a difference of opinion and reasons. I simply don't believe, he thinks it's obvious, right, that her anti-Semitism is as bad as Donald Trump's and the white nationalists. I don't, right? But I just want to say something about the question of bigotry, right? Because this question about how she's being treated is so deeply entwined with this. The system that Israel maintains in the West Bank, in which Israeli Jews live under one law and have basically full rights, free movement, due process, citizenship in the country in which they live, and the right to vote for the government that controls their lives. And Palestinians lack all of those things, right? They live under military law. They're not citizens of the country in which they live. They can't vote for its government. That is state-sponsored bigotry. That is state-sponsored bigotry. Having two systems of law in one territory, one for one ethno-religious group and the other, is state-sponsored bigotry. So if we're going to be ultra-sensitive to this question, in my view, any member of Congress who is not in opposition to Israel's undemocratic, bigoted control of the West Bank is complicit in bigotry. And it seems to me that has to be part of this conversation too, because if we're going to be ultra sensitive to these questions, there is such a thing as anti-Palestinian bigotry too. And in living for more than half century without basic rights while your Jewish neighbors enjoy all those rights is to live your entire life under a system of bigotry. And that has to be part of this conversation too.
Can I ask,
Yeah.
and maybe, please tell me if I'm mistaken, because I try to read you as often as I can. Do you know that the president of the Palestinian Authority is now in the 15th year of his elected four-term of all? No, let me finish.
Yes, go ahead.
So there actually is there is at least the architecture of a democratic system in the Palestinian Authority that has been systematically suppressed and denied, not by Israel, but by the Palestinian Authority itself. The Palestinian Authority lives under not one, but two dictatorships. One of them is a kleptocracy run by the Abbas family and his minions. The other is a theocracy. One of the small stories you may not have picked up because it wasn't extensively covered is that Palestinians were recently protesting and being beaten up in Gaza. By Israeli soldiers? No. They were being beaten up by Hamas, by a theocratic government that has ruled tyrannically since it took over in a brief civil war 12 years ago and brooks no elections, brooks no dissent, and when it finds people that it doesn't like, drags them through the streets. I'll tell you what bigotry is. It is the systematic refusal of people who claim to favor Palestinian rights to ever speak up about the fact that Palestinian rights are also being systematically denied to the Palestinian people by their leaders. Now, what you've described as bigotry is, and this system completely leaves out a fraught 52-year history that provides the critical context in which to understand why this has come about. And this is another thing that, it's sort of unworthy of argument here. Israel has been trying to get out of the occupation business for as long as I have been a politically sentient person. Now, this is ancient history for many of you, but in 1993, the Prime Minister of Israel and the head of the PLO tried to come to an agreement with the aim of ultimately creating a Palestinian state. In 2000, when most of you were babies, the Prime Minister of Israel, then Ehud Barak, offered the Palestinians a state. Now, you can have a whole kind of argument about whether the offer was a good one, but the reality is the Prime Minister of Israel offered the Palestinians a state. It was rejected by the leader of the Palestinians. 8 years later, the other Prime Minister of Israel, mysteriously also named Ehud, different guy, again offered the Palestinians a state, was rejected. Now again, Peter and I will go back and forth endlessly on little details, okay? But you can't make these statements that are utterly divorced of any sort of historical context and then say, you see, you're being complicit in an act of bigotry. I'm sorry, but you can't have an argument in the absence of actual thought and historical reality.
So I'm going to transition us a little bit. We
Can
promised.
I say something very quickly?
Yeah.
I just think that Bret's comment is why it's so important. I would so important to encourage you to go and spend time in the West Bank and see for yourself. The Palestinian Authority is not a government. When Israel wants, it arrests members of the Palestinian parliament. There's only one army that controls all the territory in the West Bank. It's the Israeli army. The Palestinians don't have an army. The Palestinian Authority is Israel's subcontractor in the West Bank. It is not an independent state. And I'm telling you, half a day with Palestinians in the West Bank will make this patently clear to you. And again, I feel like Bret, every Palestinian I know loathes Mahmoud Abbas, loathes the Palestinian Authority, but knows that the ultimate force that dominates the West Bank is not the Palestinian Authority. But Mahmoud Abbas needs the Israeli military's permission to even travel across the West Bank. He's a subcontractor of Israel, which is, and so to describe it as its own state, it seems to me, is just kind of completely divorced from the reality that you see if you spend any significant amount of time there. Anyway, sorry.
I just spent some money. I've spent more time in Gaza and the West Bank than you have, but
I just feel like when I hear you things, I just think are you interacting with Palestinians at all? Go ahead.
Okay. Well,
I would bet good money interacted with more Palestinians.
You need to interact. You need to read more clearly.
So I'm glad that we're modeling the kind of civil discourse that we're looking for tonight. I think that I want to reflect on the interchange for a moment in not only to diminish the differences of positions that you were carving out, but also inserting myself slightly, I want to understand that there's some, part of the debate is about the facts and the understanding of those facts. And part of the debate is about where the emphasis is and where it should begin, right? Does it begin with thinking about all people first, or does it begin with defending our own position first? So again, it gets a little bit tense, which is indicative of this conversation about Israel and every other conversation we could have about Israel. And underneath that are real disagreements, but there's also, I think, disagreements about starting points. I want to transition here to Israel. There was someone who's intimately involved in the past 20 years of peace negotiations who recently said in a private conversation that there never was a peace process. That the only party that talked about a peace process, by the way, this is reflecting about 3 questions that came up from the audience about what's the future of the peace process, is there a peace process? So I'm just framing it this way. And what he said is that what Israelis are primarily interested in is security and acceptance and normalcy. And what Palestinians are primarily interested in is dignity and justice. And that the only people who came in talking about peace were Americans, and that both the Israelis and Palestinians were only interested in that to the degree to which it helped get them the things they really needed, which was dignity and normalcy and protection. And so what I'm interested is, if you think about where we are now and where we could be in the future, is this question about where we in peace, is it a real thing? Is there a peace process, right? Given the framing of this individual who wanted to be confidential. And the second question is there a way forward? Is there some way that you can imagine in the next 25 years, the next 50 years, a resolution of the conflict? And I think we have about 7 minutes, so Bret, I'm going to give you 3.5, and Peter, you get the final word for 3.5.
Let me make a point that's aside from the one you made. Okay. I come from a family in which screaming is the normal mode of conversation. And it never occurs to members of our family that when we're screaming at each other that we don't love each other. Peter's starting point and his ending point is the same as mine. The starting point is passionate love and concern for the Jewish people, and his ending point is wanting to see Jews safe, flourishing, and behaving with a sense of justice both for themselves and for everybody else. And when I want to hone my arguments, and when I want to understand what the best argument on the other side that can be made is, I go and I read Peter. So I want you to come away from this conversation understanding that when we're yelling at each other, okay, it's not because I feel anything except a high sense of respect for the guy who's mouthing these contemptuous idiocies. And I don't know how he feels about me, but I just want to spend half of my 3.5 minutes saying that. Yeah, I think that's probably about right. And I think there is a solution in the sense that first of all, I think Peter and I both agree we desperately want a two-state solution. We desperately want to see an Israel that maintains its Jewish and democratic character, that can live behind secure borders and have a good relationship with all of its neighbors. And I think we both desperately want to see the Palestinian people have full access to their rights, both civically and as human beings. Now, how do you get to that? There's where we probably disagree. I know we disagree, which is on the methods. As I see it, Israel has been in a process of asking for peace since 1948, and having one group or another simply refuse to extend that peace. Israel is still fighting, not the battle of 1967, and this is where I think we fundamentally disagree. I think Israel is fighting 1948 and has never stopped fighting the War of Independence, And I think Peter thinks what we're really fighting about is what happened in 1967. What has to change? There's no question that things have to change on the Israeli side. It's why I supported Benny Gantz quite vocally, and to the annoyance of a great many ex-friends of mine in the last election. But fundamentally, I think the change that has to happen is that a great majority of the Palestinian people have to say, we are prepared to live alongside a Jewish state and do so with, and create the institutions of state that will provide prosperity for our own people, rather than simply serve as a springboard for endless grievance, endless terror, and endless war against all of our neighbors. And that requires a fundamental change in the political outlook of Palestinians. Where do they find that leadership? Where do they find those intercultural resources to make that change? I don't know, but I do know that we've seen it happen in other countries, and there's no reason it can't happen among Palestinians too.
Thank you. Peter?
Great. I also want to say that I regret the earlier spat that Bret and I have, because I did something that I feel like I don't admire in other people, which is I kind of said something kind of ad hominem, I apologize for that. The truth is I have no idea how many Palestinians you know, and it is not my right whatsoever to make. I can make arguments, I can respond to your arguments, but for me to make claims about your authority or your background is just stupid. And so I regret that. And the truth is that maybe part of my frustration is because I actually do think that Bret is so smart and thoughtful, and I know works on these issues so well, that sometimes I find it so frustrating that he doesn't see things that to me seem very clear. But you know what? They only seem clear to me. There are lots of things that seem clear to me that my wife doesn't think are so clear either.
Good wife.
And she's usually right. And
Does she regret more than she
I have a lot of family members who agree more with Bret than with me. Part of the reason that I appreciate this is, to me, I see a world in which the divisions inside the American Jewish community on this question are only going to become fiercer and greater. And to me, being part of the Jewish community is one of the most important things in my life. And so to be able, and into a world in which I was only in conversation and only had friendships with people who agreed with me politically would be a life I wouldn't want to live. So that's part of the reason that I appreciate things like this. Where I think we disagree is that I think if Israel were interested in creating a Palestinian state, first of all, it would have a prime minister who supports a Palestinian state, which this prime minister does not. And it said very explicitly, in quite a few times now in recent years, that he does not support a Palestinian state, that the IDF will never leave the West Bank in his vision. Secondly, if you want to create a Palestinian state in the West Bank, it seems to me you don't pay Israeli Jews to move to settlements. Israel massively subsidizes the settlements in all kinds of ways. There was the study that was done a little while ago that showed that the average settler receives 70% more in government subsidies than the average Israeli inside the Green Line. The most heavily subsidized municipality in the state of Israel is the settlement in Hebron. So you may or may not believe that a Palestinian state could be negotiated tomorrow. Obviously, the Palestinians are politically divided. Mahmoud Abbas is a very, very weak leader, and Hamas is still, by and large, a rejectionist movement. And I think what you would need to create a legitimate Palestinian leadership is Palestinian elections to create a legitimate, unified Palestinian leadership. By the way, Israel and the United States have opposed every Palestinian effort at unification, while also saying that the Palestinians can't be negotiated with because they're divided. But if you want to maintain the possibility of a Palestinian state one day, you shouldn't be incentivizing people to move into settlements in the West Bank and therefore eating away at the territory on which Palestinians would create a state. And yet that's exactly what this Israeli government is doing. In fact, 28 out of the 30 members of the Knesset who are elected not only support that, they support outright annexation of the West Bank. Right? So this talking point that Israel really, really wants a state in the West Bank, it seems to be hard to be credible at a time when you have a prime minister who publicly opposes the Palestinian state in perpetuity, and most of the people in his party want to officially annex chunks of the West Bank and officially put the final nail in the coffin. And that worries me a lot, because I think the result of that will be a great deal of violence, and ultimately will be also it'll be a Palestinian movement that asks for one person, one vote between the Jordan and the Mediterranean. And that movement, I think, ultimately will be an existential threat to Israel as a Jewish state.
Well, everyone, thank you. Peter and Bret, thank you for all of your insight. Before we go, I'd like to invite Listening is a student leader who helped put tonight together, and she has some gifts for you guys, and to say thank you to everyone.
Sure. Hi, I'm Teva. I'm a member of the Penn Israel Alliance, and on behalf of Pia and the Penn Hillel board and everyone who's here tonight, I really wanted to thank you both for coming. You both spoke so highly of one another, and I want to second everything that you said. You were so thoughtful and intelligent, and I definitely learned a lot tonight, and I know everyone else did too. So thank you. You guys both get the same gift.
So I think there's reception outside. No? Okay. Thank you guys. Good luck with finals. Have a great summer. If you have 2 seconds, you can grab a picture, but it's quick because they have trains to catch. But nice to see everyone. Thank you.